Welcome, everyone. Big question facing the world today is as we enter a more geopolitically fractured, contested world, what is the future of clean energy innovation? We're going to have a special event today. I'm Joseph Majkut, Director of the Energy Security and Climate Change Program here at CSIS. I'm joined by my friend, colleague, and former DOE official, Jigar Shah, for a conversation on this question. Jigar, welcome to CSIS today.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, the context of today's conversation is you and I spent the last few days in Europe, in Brussels, and in London, talking to energy innovators, to financiers, to policymakers about what the forward-looking plan for clean energy innovation in Europe and the UK might be. We had a really fascinating set of conversations, and we decided on our way back, well, we should record some of our impressions and try and get some of the key learnings out there in the world. As you think about that, what was, let's start with you. What was the timber of the conversation? And when we set off, what were you hoping to accomplish?
Well, maybe we should start with it was very obvious from our conversations that when the United States set off to shorten supply chains and do things more locally, that was a big departure from the conventional wisdom, I would say, of Europe for sure. But also, for the world more broadly, right? I think there was a feeling that global trade led to the lowest possible cost of imports and infrastructure broadly. I think that today, the mood has changed. People recognize that importing fossil fuels, whether it's oil or LNG, is sort of the most expensive way to meet their lifestyle needs, and that choosing to deploy technology locally and increasingly having more of it made on the continent was something that they wanted to do. And then I think the question then becomes, was there an appetite to do it? I think, clearly with all the announcements coming out of the EU right now and the strategy that the UK has announced months ago, there is some appetite. And then the next stage is, okay, what lessons do we have from our experience for the last 4 years? And I think there was an intense interest on the fact that I think people recognize what policies they want to do, right? Those are their policies to choose, and they, I think, have done that, and we can talk about how they got there. But they also recognize that once the policies are in place, the private sector doesn't necessarily come to the party. And, so how did we get the private sector to the party the last 4 years was, I think, a big part of the conversation. And so, yeah, it was a fascinating set of conversations, and that's largely why we went over there, is I think there was a recognition that we did things differently to get the private sector to be enthusiastic about the Inflation Reduction Act.
So if you have the moment that we're in, we're recording on the 20th of March, 2025. One of the things I saw in nearly every conversation that we had was, I would say, like an awakening, like a real sense of renewed vigor around the need for Europe to stand on its own. I mean, the Trump administration has raised threatened tariffs, is pushing for renewed defense spending in Europe. It felt to me, we heard from multiple people what seemed impossible as a matter of public policy 6 months ago now suddenly feels on the table. Did you get that same vibe?
Yeah, I think for a long time, I think that there was some feeling on the part of the Europeans that they were market takers. And I think for the first time, I felt like they wanted to try to be a market maker, right? And what was so weird to me is that they were market makers. Right? I mean, they were the ones who created the feed-in tariffs in Germany in 2003 and in Spain and Italy, right? They're the ones who drove the costs of solar panels down and wind power down and all those things, right? Hell, they did the same thing in offshore wind, right? They've developed lots of offshore wind. And so for them to have this feeling that like they needed, permission to really be the market leader, I found was fascinating because I was like, but you guys are some of the smartest people I know with some of the best companies that I know of. And but I agree that the swagger was there, that they felt like this was their time and this was something that they could do.
Yeah. I mean, I think obviously execution is a question, right? There's a renewed sense of vigor. We spent less time talking about what's the long-term strategy and more time talking about what is immediately possible to do and what yields immediate results, whether that's faster deployment of long duration energy storage or the development of sustainable aviation fuel, anything related to that triumvirate of energy affordability, energy security, and reducing emissions. There's a lot of energy to pursue those goals. They were really interested to hear from you because of the experience having just run the LPO. Now you're out in civil society again, able to speak freely and share what we learned. One of the things that I thought was most interesting was the different framework that you were able to present. So LPO makes loans, right? It's in the name. This is a debt instrument to help new companies scale up proven technology. How do you think that resonated, right? Because like oftentimes they were thinking grants, they were thinking equity investments out of the public, but this would, we had to make clear that the DOE's LPO was successful largely because it had a pretty focused set of tools and a mission. Did you feel that was heard?
I think people were gobsmacked. Frankly, I think they are in the United States as well, to be clear. But like the fact that the LPO makes money, right, and has very little fiscal impact on the balance sheet slash the budget of the United States government, and certainly in would be the same for the EU or the UK. I think was something that just did not occur to them, right? Like it just did not occur to them that this tool is actually far more capital efficient and budgetary efficient than really any other tool for commercialization. And I think that it was an interesting thing because they actually don't have a natural place by which to replicate the loan programs office in the EU. The natural place might be the EIB, but the EIB is been around since 1958 and really likes to do investment grade credit work with their AAA rating. And so there was no natural institution that could replicate the LPO. But it is something that I think people just never thought that a loan program was dramatically different from a budgetary standpoint from a grant program. I think that was just something they never really thought through.
Well, they also didn't, and I've learned this over the last few years. They didn't really think through why a loan program was important for commercially scaling technologies. Maybe you can kind of give us a brief explanation of why that is. But in terms of a mechanism of industrial policy, it actually imposes a lot of discipline and forces a lot of learning that is important for later commercially oriented loans to come into the picture.
Yeah, it was a fascinating conversation because I think it started with exactly what you said, which is, this whole concept of a bridge to bankability. What are we bridging to? You're generally bridging to the commercial debt markets. And so if you provide a number of grants to projects, that doesn't mean that a debt provider in the future is ready to catch that ball. When you provide loans, especially if you use a very rigorous commercial underwriting standard, which we do at the Loan Programs Office, then the handoff to the commercial sector is actually quite smooth. And then the natural next question from them was, but what about additionality? If it's so damn smooth to do the handoff, well, why couldn't they have done it in the first place? And, I think the answer, as you pointed out, quite eloquently, is really just that they don't want to be first, right? That there is this initiative problem. And the commercial banks are saying, we really want someone else to do the first six deals. And then we're happy to come in for the seventh, right? And there's no logic behind it as much as there's, if we're the first to do something, we've got six parties within the bank that has to approve it, and we got to write all these white papers, and we have to do all this education, and I can make my bonus so much more easily by doing this other deal. And so, why would I work that hard? Once you've done six deals, the white paper is already written, everything's already there. It's a lot easier for me to take it through. And it matters because for a lot of these companies in Europe, they're deciding how to scale up their technology. And if no one provides them that first big debt check, then they're going to likely go to Asia or some other place to scale up their technology.
This seems like a really one of the reasons why this was an interesting time to go is also the moment we're in. So Europe has been dealing with the energy crisis provoked by the Russian invasion of Ukraine now for 3 years. And it's great that US LNG played such a significant role in keeping the lights on. Markets prove themselves as being a guarantor of security. That's a very positive story, but it's also clear that the way that Europe has managed this crisis has been unsustainable in terms of how much it costs. And the only way out is through a much more diversified, affordability focused energy strategy. Or I wouldn't even say strategy, I would say approach to energy, because the energy strategies that we see published are oftentimes totally divorced from the reality of what you can commercialize and what you can commercialize quickly. If you had a list of things to do in the course of a year or two to really reduce energy prices and put these countries back on a path to an affordable, more resilient, more secure energy system, one that is much less import dependent, given all your experience over the last few years, where should they look?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we did when we were in office was write these pathways to commercial liftoff reports.
Hmm.
And those liftoff reports were very clear about where the commercial marketplace was today around scaling up. So when you think about what the Venn diagram looks like between pollution, affordability, and national security, there's, a set of technologies that are ready to go, that are ready to scale up, right? One set was deployed at, fairly large scale in response to Ukraine, right? Which is a lot of distributed generation, right? Now, getting that distributed generation to be used within a virtual power plant type setting is still early days. And the Europeans are actually ahead of us in here in the United States, and they're still only at 1/10 of where they need to be, right? And what that means is 50% of all the money that you spend on upgrading distribution circuits is spent because you're just lazy, right? Because you're like, well, we want to make sure that if everyone plugs in their car and everyone turns on their heat pump at the exact same time, that the distribution circuit can handle it. Well, when you overbuild it to that level, now you're only using it maybe 25% of the time, right? That's a really poor asset utilization, right? So you're paying for all of it, but not using it very much, right? So by doing, strategic deployments of batteries, thermostats, figuring out electric vehicle charging, all of which, a company like Octopus Energy is already doing in the UK, and their Kraken software is already being used by E.ON and Enel in, across the European continent, can be deployed quickly. I think some of the other tools that that can be deployed quickly are things that unlock the ability to trade power across the 27 member states. So when you think about grid enhancing technologies like dynamic line ratings or advanced conductors, right, where you can reconductor an existing transmission right of way and increase the capacity by 3x. And that technology is available today. Or when you think about just the ability for you to more efficiently utilize the transmission grid, right? We just talked about the distribution grid. But on the transmission grid is also built for all of the wind power blowing at the same time, going into the transmission line, or all the solar going into the solar, going into the transmission system. By co-locating long duration energy storage at the point of interconnection for the solar and wind farm, you can force that solar and wind farm to say, hey, wait a second, let's more optimally use this transmission line and take half of your output and put it into the grid. The other half, let's stick it in the battery. And then later in the evening or some other time when, we need it, we'll pull it back out, right? These are ways to get way more out of the capacity you've already paid for and can immediately reduce bills for people across the continent. And more importantly, a lot of these technologies originated from companies in Europe and can be scaled up to meet a lot of their local manufacturing ambitions in Europe.
Man, that seems like a key question. You know, you have European companies, you've got companies out of the US that produce these
Sure.
technologies, and they're just not being commercialized in Europe despite, stronger climate regulations than we have in the US. And it seems to me, having talked to a lot of folks, there's big macro reasons for that, right? The nature of the finance environment in Europe, the fragmentation across all these different markets, never mind then the UK, which is sort of a separate animal. The risk appetite that you have amongst institutional investors, all those things are being worked on right now as part of a broader effort to rejuvenate the European economy. And then you've just got the sort of technology innovation questions of how do you get the first few projects demonstrated so that when you create a lot of or I would say investment appetite for those kinds of technologies, that appetite can be realized. Key differences between the EU and the US that you have in mind?
Well, I would say the key differences between the EU and the US over the last 4 years,
Hmm.
right? Because I think the US actually suffered from largely the same challenge around commercialization of technology that
Right.
the EU has suffered over the last, 40 years probably. Um, and I think what part of what we did in the United States is we basically made it so damn clear that we had solutions that were 90% cheaper than what people were doing, but they still weren't doing it, that in some ways we softly embarrassed people into actually moving away from their cultural inertia
Hmm.
norms, right? And you see that with one of the long duration energy storage companies we met in Europe, told us that 80% of their long duration energy storage pipeline was in the US,
Yep. I did.
right? I mean, I don't think that was true 4 years ago, but it's
Right.
certainly true now, right? And that's because people have recognized that energy storage can basically be a virtual form of transmission,
Hmm.
right? And so, that I think is super important. And without doing that, I think you're in this weird spot where you're just not capable of like really absorbing all of the new solar and all the new wind on the existing system.
And what is your view on, we were in Brussels. Brussels is its own beast, right? It doesn't have a reputation for a lot of innovation. We were in the UK, which I think kind of fairly does have a historical reputation for innovation. One of the key things that you and I think, both noticed was a real sense of optimism and opportunity in Brussels, and sort of a more dour mood in the UK. Do you think you were able to move them more toward the optimistic side of the ledger?
Well, we certainly pointed out that they had a more dour mood, and
Yeah.
I thought they found that funny. Um, I mean, the one thing that's interesting is the National Wealth Fund in the UK really is a place where you could put the loan programs office,
Yeah.
right, in the UK, right? So that institution is tailor made to really just replicate the loan programs office, not just for energy projects, because obviously the National Wealth Fund has a broader ambition around defense projects and other projects as well, but I think the instrument of the loan programs office continues to make a lot of sense in the UK. I think the other piece of this, though, also is just again going back to the inertia, right? Which is that if people can do things and have proven things in the past, um, how do you get people to go to this 10x level? And part of what we talked about was yes, we're open for business. So one of the things that I thought people were surprised by is that the loan programs office said we're for everything against nothing, right?
Right.
So we are equally enthusiastic about carbon capture and nuclear as we are of long duration energy storage, hydrogen, and geothermal, right?
Right.
And that was surprising to everybody. They were like, "Well, shouldn't you have more of an opinion from a top down basis?" And I was like, "No, we're for innovators commercializing their technology, whether they save 10% versus the baseline on pollution or whether they save 90% versus the baseline on pollution. We're for all of it, right? It's a pass-fail test. It's not a grade on that front. And that then sends the signal to the marketplace and their investors that you're fully open for business, that you're not going to be judgmental and be arbitrary and capricious about how you're going to pick who to support. And I thought that was people were very, very surprised that that was our point of view at the loan programs office. They really thought we were racking and stacking all of these projects on a regular basis and picking winners.
Well,
And
and
when, so good.
that is like a key industrial policy question, right? Is where do you make which decision? Because one of the things that I think is to be avoided is you give the responsibility to get everything absolutely right to everybody in the innovation chain. And that is, I think, one of the things we learned. And insofar as this was an opportunity for us to share a learning from the US experience over the last few years, is it's much better to sort of say, all right, if you're not going to be ready for a loan on near commercial terms, like there's a different part of the Department of Energy or the
That's
Department
right.
of Commerce or whomever who's going to help on that process, right? That's a science and tech innovation question. And then, if, the right balance of electricity sources in the US grid is a question for like state regulators. It's a question for national policy, should they choose to make decisions in that way. But it's not really a question we want the LPO worried about too much, because you want the focused institutional dynamic to be around scaling up new technologies and making sure that the way in which they scale is going to be replicable in a fully commercial environment. Like you have to apply some market discipline.
Yeah, I mean, another really important point that came up in our meetings was domestic content, right?
Mhm.
And the loan programs office has no domestic content requirements,
Right.
right? Now, the Biden administration put on this Buy America provision for bipartisan infrastructure law money, right? But again, that's a policy that's done outside of the loan programs office. And so part of what was super important was saying to people that the loan programs office does not apply any restrictions at all, except for you have to have a minimum reduction in pollution. You have to actually be affordable, right? You have to meet the reasonable prospect of repayment. And all of the proceeds of the loan programs office has to be for US investment, right? For continental, well, actually, it's all the territories, et cetera, US investment, right? And so, and I think that was quite shocking to people that we were so open about that. But I think what's critical there is that that's how you get enthusiasm from the private sector. We then matched that with the liftoff reports, which basically educated a whole bunch of people that were frankly focused on solar, wind, and battery storage, and said, here's how you could look at the opportunity set in hydrogen, long duration energy storage, carbon management, nuclear, et cetera. Now, whether they decide to take us up on that and decide to invest in that is their own choice. But it created a huge amount of enthusiasm and crowded in probably $150 billion worth of equity that matched some of the grants and then the loans. And that's the other thing that I tried to remind people of is that we're not picking winners and losers. We're saying that everyone who meets this criteria gets a loan. The people who are picking winners and losers are the equity providers, right? Because they're the first loss capital. If they put money in and the project underperforms, they lose 100% of their cash before we lose any money. And then, the loan programs office has averaged 55 cents on the dollar in terms of recovery rates from projects that, we lost money on. And so in the end, the loan programs office has only had roughly a 3% loss rate, which again, I think was very surprising to people. They would have expected much higher losses for the fact that we were doing first of a kind projects.
Yeah, they were used to a lot of government-driven boondoggles, not a selective process to yield more commercially successful endeavors. Um, you know, Obviously, right now the U.S. relationship with UK and the EU is under strain. It's changing. I think that this kind of engagement is actually a great way to maintain a positive transatlantic relationship, right? We've got a ton of innovators here in the US. We've learned a lot about how to accomplish these goals over the last few years. I don't think it's all going to go away under this new administration, but definitely we're in a position where Europe and the UK can be fast followers on a lot of successes that the U.S. has had over the last few years. If that's true, what's next?
Well, that's right. I mean, I think that, there's 400 or so people who got substantial grants or loans out of the loan programs office, and then all the grant making bodies within the Undersecretary for Infrastructure branch within the Department of Energy. So think the Office of Clean Energy Demonstration or the Manufacturing Electricity Supply Chain Office, et cetera. And think, grants that are $25 million and above, right? Those 400 companies are the best that America has to offer, right? So when you think about how many thousands of people applied for all of those things. And those are the folks who got selected, right? So we did all the hard work, right? And, with all of the chaos that's going on right now, some of them are saying, are the grants going to get released, right? They still haven't released all the grants from the Manufacturing Electricity Supply Chain Office, right, that were already approved. And so I think a lot of folks are saying, I might decide to go to another country to scale up my stuff. Right. And so I think you could see really a full court press from the EU and the UK to court these companies. I got a call from my Australian friends, funny enough, on the drive back home, from the airport.
Mhm.
And so the Australian folks are saying, hey, we actually have institutions that can do this as well. And thanks for going through that long list of companies and picking the 400 best ones. We'd love to pick those off. And all of that information is publicly available on the website at the Department of Energy. So it's not confidential information who got grants.
Right.
And so, I mean, I do think that that's going to be important. The other piece, though, is from the diplomacy standpoint, remember that this is a global phenomenon. This is not just a West phenomenon.
Yep.
Everyone in the entire globe is saying, we would like to reduce our reliance on imported fossil fuels, whether it's LNG or oil. Yes, we need it. It's an essential ingredient to a modern lifestyle. But to the extent that, India is spending $167 billion a year on imported fossil fuels, they're viewing that as a pot of money that they might be able to redirect towards domestic investment. So, and that's why they're announcing big plans on nuclear power. That's
Mhm.
why they're announcing big plans on electrification and electric vehicles and some of that work. And so I think the tools that we're talking about here is a formula that one, like provides this sort of budgetary um, discipline, right?
Mhm.
That I think the EU and the UK are definitely very interested in. And I think it is a way to strengthen the transatlantic partnership, regardless of, what the sitting administration does. Um, but I think it's also a diplomatic approach to going to global South countries, sorry, and saying to them, this is a tool that you can use because of the budget discipline here.
Right.
And we can crowd in private sector capital and bring in some of the world's best companies, right? Because, you can imagine that some of these countries actually might have native advantages that the companies are looking for in terms of either market or cost to manufacture or some of those
Totally.
things.
I mean,
Um,
you're definitely going to need long duration energy storage in India.
yeah,
Brazil has huge potential in hydrogen. Indonesia has, incredible pore space. If we can get carbon removal or carbon or CCS going in Southeast Asia, I mean, there's a ton of opportunity there, and there is a geopolitical angle as well, right? That
yeah.
it is untenable that all these novel technologies, many of which the U.S. has invested in through grant making and supporting fundamental research, and all that, get totally lost to China because they can't be commercialized globally.
And
And
our current president is telling people to do this. I
Mhm.
mean, this is not like something that is sort of, adjacent to what he's saying or sort of slightly different. He's saying every single country should become more localized, right? That is his core message and has been since 2016,
Mhm.
right? That we should have a little less trade and a little more localization, right? And so I think you're starting to see an intense interest now that we've spent the better part of 20 years providing venture capital, growth capital to all these companies. And all these technologies are actually now, because of this extraordinary last 4 years, many of these companies have gotten the resources they need to cross that bridge to bankability. They might need a little bit more, but a lot of the countries are saying, we can help you with that last step, that risk profile we can accept,
Yeah.
right? And so I think we frankly learned a lot. I learned a lot out of these visits. And I think the level of enthusiasm around replicating the formula that we came up with, which included, this really rigorous, for everything against nothing approach to running the loan programs office. This matching it with the liftoff reports to really educate the private sector on how they might benefit from it. And then the last piece is having the Deploy 23 and 24 conferences where you brought all the risk takers with their investment partners and others to the table, I think caused that ecosystem to then form to help each other really get to the finish line. And I think that last piece is also critical to making sure that you actually get that last push that you need to get to final investment decision.
Well, hopefully that'll be in the offing that like the next time we head over there, we can do so with a bunch of American companies looking to export goods, services, and knowledge, and really bring out into the world a lot of the key lessons we've learned and a lot of the human and intellectual capital we've built here in the United States over the last few years. Much of that under your leadership. Thank you very much for that. Is there anything else?
It was a great time, and so I really appreciate hanging out with you for a couple of days, and we got to do that again.
Yeah, definitely. Likewise, very fun trip, really interesting set of folks we talked to. And many thanks to all the people who hosted us along the way because we really did learn a lot. I learned a lot, and I think it's going to mean a lot for our work here at CSIS going forward, and hopefully for all those folks, it gives them tools to secure a cleaner and more resilient and more secure future.
Well, thanks for continuing to invest in this conversation. Super important.
Of course. Jigar, until next time, all the best.
All right. Thank you.